Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to AIMA, to Rekha for giving me the opportunity to be back here. It's lovely to be in the midst of all of you. It's great to be back in a packed hall, in person as opposed to a virtual screen. Many thanks to the Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, for joining us here for this session, which I hope will be provocative, interesting, and will give us a lot of food for thought. The way that we're going to run it is that Dr. Nageswaran will speak, give us a keynote address for about 10 minutes, and then we'll get down to a fireside chat between him and me. And of course, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So if you do have questions, then you can shoot them in, but do keep them brief. So without further ado, let me hand it over to the Chief Executive Officer.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My sincere thanks to the All India Management Association, the office bearers, for their kind invitation to me to share my thoughts with you on balancing compulsions, aspirations, and the vision for a $5 trillion economy, or even bigger than that. As we all know very well, the last 2 years has been difficult times, and that's about the compulsion that was imposed on us by an unseen pathogen, which forced us to undertake immediate and urgent responses. At the same time, like it has been the case across the world over time, crises always have brought with them also opportunities to keep the long-term vision, the long-term focus in mind, and proceed to undertake steps along with the immediate firefighting measures. And that is what the government has been doing with its multiple Atmanirbhar packages in 2020 and 2021. While there has been a steady flow of support, especially to the vulnerable sections of the economy, through the Prime Minister's Garib Kalyan Yojana, through the emergency credit line guarantee schemes that afforded, that bankrolled or underwrote credit given by the banking system to the micro, small and medium enterprises, to several other, to the cash transfer support for farmers. So like these several measures were implemented to make sure that the impact of the virus, the impact of economic disruption on ordinary people's lives, livelihoods, and incomes were minimized to the extent possible. At the same time, the government did not lose sight of the fact that here was an economy that was coming out of a decade of balance sheet repair. If you cast your minds back to the first decade of the new millennium, between 2003 and 2012, barring 2008, which was the year of the global financial crisis, in those 9 years, by and large, the Indian economy grew rapidly. Banks were willing to lend. Corporates, non-financial corporates, were willing to borrow and invest, and foreign money flowed in copiously as well into the country. But as is often the case, boom times beget difficult times, or as the economist Minsky put it, stability begets instability. That's again given based on global history. So that led to some loans that should not have been made or borrowed going bad. And we spent the rest of the decade of the 20s, between 13 and 20 or 14 and 20, depending on your starting point, repairing balance sheets both in the financial sector and in the non-financial sector, which was compounded by the collapse of IL&FS as well in 2018, a non-banking financial company. So the rest of the decade was all about getting balance sheets back on track. And that is very similar to what we went through between 1998 and 2002 as well. Back then also we had a banking non-performing loan problem. Corporates spent 4 to 5 years getting their balance sheets in shape. And that is why when 2003, when global conditions turned favorable, corporates had the balance sheet capacity to be able to borrow and invest. And we were actually reaching that point, the favorable inflection point, by the end of the decade 2020 when the pandemic arrived. So, in order to take advantage of the fact that balance sheets have indeed been repaired and the corporates were willing to spend, the government also cut corporate taxes in 2019 September, which left more money in the hands of corporates, because after all, it is not the interest rates that matter for companies to undertake investments. What matters are two important variables. One is the demand outlook, and second is the profitability. And one of those boxes was checked with profitability and lower and higher after-tax income. So, because of the pandemic and the shock it had on incomes and economic growth and employment, somebody has to run with the baton of keeping the economy growing in these difficult times, and that is why the government took it upon itself to undertake capital expenditure, further boost physical infrastructure, build a digital architecture as well, which also facilitated financial inclusion. So all these activities were done even as the government worked on the side to minimize the devastating impact of the pandemic on vulnerable sections of the society. And also, along with the capital gains, along with the income tax cut and the capital spending plans, the government also launched the production-linked incentive schemes, which is aimed at creating global capacity on Indian soil to cater both to domestic demand and to take advantage of global markets. And we just heard news in the last week or two that iPhones production would also be shortly commencing in India. So where we are today is that after the first two waves in 2020 and 2021, we were also relatively lucky and fortunate, and we needed that luck, of course, all of us, that the third wave was relatively mild in terms of its impact, both economically and in terms of its health consequences. But before we could, therefore, embark on the long-awaited economic expansion, we have now confronted with the geopolitical conflict in Europe, which obviously has implications for commodity prices, energy, food, fertilizer, along with the uncertainty it casts on the global security and peace, which are important bedrock for economic growth and economic activity. So there is a renewed uncertainty on that front. Further compounding or complicating the situation is the potential for the United States Federal Reserve to be raising interest rates. They are sounding very aggressive about their intent, and that will naturally, if you go by history, naturally have implications for financial markets in the United States, which will then spill over into the rest of the world as well. These are the short-term headwinds that we are faced with. However, I would submit that the Indian economic glass is more than half full for the simple reason that, relatively speaking, and even in absolute terms, we do have macroeconomic stability in the country. The fact that we are all exercised about a consumer price index inflation rate of around 6% actually attests to the success we have with our inflation targeting framework, because gone are the times when we fret about inflation only when it heads towards high single digits or double digits. We are now worried about even slight overshoot above the 6% range, and that means we have raised the bar on ourselves on inflation, which is a good thing. And the government over the last 2 to 3 years has been cleaning up its own budget numbers so much so that what you see is what you get. There is transparency. There are no extra budgetary resources which are now shipped off to the public sector enterprises to spend. Government has taken upon the capital expenditure on the budget. They are not off budget. And more importantly, revenue assumptions and growth assumptions are very much realistic. Most of you might be reading the headlines that many international agencies and financial institutions are revising their growth forecast down for many countries around the world, including India. Even RBI brought down the growth forecast for 22-23 from 7.8% to 7.2%. However, the good news is that if you look at the budget documents, the government of India budgeted only for 11.1% nominal GDP growth in 22-23. You can split it whichever way you like between real and inflation. If you go by the assumption that it is 7 plus 4 or 8 plus 3 or 6.5 plus 4.5, the important point is government wasn't making its revenue projections based on a much higher GDP growth, which would have then necessitated cutbacks to expenditure and which would have then meant even lower growth. Because the assumptions were realistic to start with, the impact on government's ambitious capital expenditure plans would be minimal. At the same time, realizing that this shock to food, fertilizer, and energy prices is going to be there, last couple of weeks the government has also announced extension of the Garib Kalyan Yojana program for another 6 more months, which will cost about 80,000 crores, annualized about 1.6 lakh crores, and that would amount to 0.65% of GDP. So the government continues to balance, as the title of this speech suggests, its short-term compulsions without losing sight of the longer-term aspirations, macroeconomic stability, prudent budgeting, transparency, emphasis on capital expenditure, the robust state of balance sheets within the private sector, whether it is financial or non-financial, would enable the Indian economy to weather the current twin storms, as I see it, geopolitical and the Federal Reserve tightening that is likely to come in the months. And I think as we head towards the second half of 22-23, blue skies will reappear, and we can look ahead to a decade of India repeating in a more sustainable form the kind of high growth we experienced between 2003 and 2012. Thank you very much. And I once again thank the organizers for inviting me to speak to you. And I look forward to my interaction with Shereen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nageswaran, for very comprehensively articulating for us what the short-term headwinds are, but more importantly, what we should be focused on as far as the long-term is concerned. Several important aspects that you brought out. Of course, the balance sheet repair process that has been underway for the last few years, and whether that now gives the ability for the corporate sector to revive the investment cycle, whether we are going to see a return of private capex, is the big question that everyone is focused on. But outside of that, let me address the growth issue to start with. As you pointed out, there is a downward revision of growth forecast at this point in time. The RBI has revised its forecast lower to 7.2% from 7.8% for FY23. Let me go back to the economic survey. And I don't know how many of you remember, but Dr. Nageswaran joined quite literally on the day that the economic survey was presented in Parliament. The economic survey had forecast a growth rate of between 8 to 8.5%, but it was also incumbent on several factors, and one of the key factors was oil prices being in the range of 70 to 75. Even when you presented the survey, oil was at 90. Now it's closer to 100. Will these forecasts have to see a significant downward revision?
The assumption of $70 to $75 per barrel for the oil price made by the survey was an average number for the whole year. We might still end up achieving it. You never know. So I think it will be too premature at this point to say that these forecasts are liable for a downward revision, because the financial has barely started, and the oil price outcome will naturally depend on not only supply coming back, but also high oil prices are a cure for high oil prices because of the demand destruction that they cause. So the answer is, if oil prices do persist at levels north of 100 for a long period, then yes, the number may have to be revised. But as I said, the assumptions made in the budget were around 7%. So in that sense, it wouldn't necessitate a big revision to budget projections. And as far as the RBI is concerned, I think they are realistic in bringing it down to 7.2%. I think from this point on, I would say downside risk to those numbers is quite limited.
Okay, let me address that issue with you as far as oil prices are concerned. I think everyone in this room is hoping that this 5-day pause that we've seen continues. I want to understand from you, why have we actually seen this pause as far as oil price hikes are concerned? Does that mean that a large part of the under-recoveries that oil marketing companies had to deal with has been addressed at this point in time? Or is this a political call, a political decision? If you could help explain to us what we should expect in terms of the oil price trajectory going forward. And if at all, oil were to, as you said, persist above $100 a barrel, what is the most uncomfortable level that you believe? Is it 110? Is it 115? By when you believe the government will need to act to ensure that there is distribution of burden?
To answer your first question, why there is a pause, I think probably the question is better addressed to the oil marketing companies rather than to me.
Except they don't answer it.
So then if they are not in a position to answer, then certainly I'm not in a position to answer that either. But I think the fact is, there is government, it is quite possible that they have not fully passed on the impact of the high crude oil prices to the end users. And secondly, I feel that if prices remain persistently above $110 per barrel for a quarter or two, then yes, there has to be a burden sharing that has to happen, and that will involve oil marketing companies, the government, and the consumers, because this is a global supply shock, and therefore all of us have to bear the consequences of it. It is not engineered by anyone. And sometimes we have to, and I mean, life is all about trade-offs, whether it is individuals or whether it is nations. So when you talk of a policy response, we have to make a choice between providing relief in a targeted manner or enacting an omnibus tax reduction. And what the government has done with its extension of the Garib Kalyan Yojana program is to sort of use the fiscal space to provide targeted relief. So we need to analyze the situation and the possible government response in a holistic manner and not just focus on a piecemeal item of the oil taxes.
I don't want to labor too much on oil, but I'll ask you one quick follow-up question on it. You said that if it persists above $110 and if it persists for a quarter or two, then you believe that there might need to be a change as far as the way that the government is addressing it. If it were to boil down to a cut in excise duties, if that scenario were to play out, how much pressure would it put on the government's ability to spend?
I think it's difficult to come up with the orders of magnitude straight off the bat. It would obviously have an impact, but it would be probably depending on the amount of cut that is offered, and if such assumptions are met, it probably would amount to about 0.2 to 0.4% of GDP. But then, as I said, it depends on how soon or how later this becomes necessary and the amount of tax cut, and therefore whether it would impact the 6.4% of GDP budget deficit that we have budgeted for would also depend on revenue buoyancy, which so far has been quite good, but we need to wait and see. And again, I'm heartened by the assumptions in the budget, which do not require any drastic reduction. So overall, I think at this point in time, there are any number of scenarios we can envisage which will invalidate the budget, but there is equally a large number of scenarios in which I would think the overall budget numbers would hold good.
You know, if anything, the revenue estimates have actually been on the conservative side, and you've bettered them. So that's clearly the cushion as far as the government is concerned. But you spoke about inflation, and you said that as far as corporate India is concerned, the two key factors that they focus on is demand visibility and profitability. But I would imagine that the government is going to be concerned about inflation and what that does in terms of your borrowing costs. Given where we find ourselves at the end of what the MPC has said and its commentary, the expectation, if I were to just quote what Uday Kotak believes, he's asking the question, are we likely to see 4 rate hikes a quarter each? What's your own expectation?
Shereen, I have made it a policy not to comment on monetary policy in public.
Okay.
I should leave it to the RBI to make their own decisions. They don't need my advice.
I want to ask you to tell me what quantum of hikes you believe that we're likely to see. But we are now headed, in your assessment, into a trajectory of an upward rate cycle?
Sure. Obviously, again, you read the RBI communication. I too read the same thing. So I think you are more than welcome to draw your own conclusions.
I won't be able to elicit any comment from you on that front at all.
I don't want to, as a member of the Ministry of Finance, I want to stay away from commenting on monetary policy in public.
You won't comment on the monetary policy in India, but let me get you to comment on the monetary policy in the West. And then let me get you to comment on what the Fed is likely to do. Because as you pointed out that you believe the Fed will move on hiking rates, but do you believe, in your words, it will be as aggressive as the expectation is? Will the Fed walk the talk when it comes to hiking rates?
No, honestly, I'm surprised by the extent of hawkishness that the Federal Reserve officials have displayed in the last several weeks or even couple of months. And if their projections are right on what the market is expecting, they expect to see the federal funds rate at 2.75% by the end of the financial year for India, by March 2023. That would be quite aggressive. Now, whether the reaction of the US economy and the US financial markets would allow them to carry out these series of rate hikes that would take the federal funds rate to 2.75%, I don't know, because the last time when the Federal Reserve was embarking on a normalization cycle, they had to stop at 2.5% in 2018. So we are waiting to see the peak as far as this cycle is concerned. But what looks more likely is that aggressive actions are more likely to be front-loaded rather than back-loaded.
Okay.
So, and therefore we have to weather the first quarter, fiscal quarter, as far as India is concerned, because we have 2 Federal Reserve meetings in May and June before the first quarter ends for us. So I think those front-loaded actions will give us a lot of clarity and visibility at the end of it as to how far they would go.
Okay, so a front-loading of Fed action is what you anticipate. Yeah. On the other headwind that you spoke of, and you said that there is renewed uncertainty, and there is not so much that we have or we can control, especially as far as geopolitical alignments are concerned, as well as what is playing out between Russia and Ukraine. What could be the direct impact of that, or which sectors do you believe are likely to be most directly impacted by that back home?
So our direct trade with these 2 countries is relatively small, nor are we big recipients of foreign direct investment from these countries, and whatever foreign direct investment flows we are getting from elsewhere is also likely to be unaffected. If anything, the difficulties or the reduction in the quantum of securing wheat supplies from these 2 countries actually opens up an opportunity for India's farmers. So obviously the indirect impact is larger, partly through the global impact on energy prices, the impact because of the hydrocarbon feedstock on fertilizer prices, and food prices can work both ways for India as a benefit as well as global spillovers affecting. So by and large, I think the spillovers are more likely to be indirect than direct for us.
Okay, let me address the issue of your assessment in terms of credit growth, credit offtake, as well as the pickup as far as the capex cycle is concerned. We've seen what the RBI has to say. They do still see a considerable gap in output, but what's your own sense based on high-frequency indicators, high-frequency data, as well as what the banking system's telling you?
I'm actually quite heartened by the numbers I see in the high-frequency indicators, because the orders placed on capital equipment producing companies and the sub-index of the index of industrial production for capital goods, both are showing a very strong recovery trend. And those 2 are very definitive heartening signs. And also if you look at the credit offtake in the March numbers, I think bank credit is beginning to pick up, especially to medium enterprises. And therefore, I think it is probably towards the end of the second quarter, July to September, or in the second half of the year, we are more likely to see the private sector picking up the baton of capital expenditure. And let's not forget that the RBI's survey on capacity utilization and order book showed a jump in the capex capacity utilization by the industry from 68 to 74%. So, and in several sectors, the top 4 enterprises are already operating at more than 80% capacity. So I am quite optimistic that sooner rather than later, Indian private sector will pick up the capital expenditure baton from the government and run with it.
Well, that has been the hope and the expectation for a while now, and you're hoping that in the second half we could start to see that happen. Yeah. We've got lots of questions coming in, but let me, before I address those, we've addressed some of the immediate challenges that we need to cope with. But let me ask you more medium term and more long term. You listed out a list of reform measures that the government has already undertaken, whether it was the cut in corporate taxes or it's the PLI schemes, 13 of them that have already been announced. Where do you believe the focus or the emphasis now needs to be, in addition to what has already been announced and done?
So a couple of focus areas. One is obviously implementation of several measures that have been announced in the last 2 years. That has to be the focus. Whether it is asset monetization or privatization, i.e. government wants to withdraw totally from non-strategic sectors and just retain a token presence in strategic sectors. Now that needs to be executed. And the second area of reform would be in education and health, and those are subjects that lie in the realm of the states. So I think as far as the union government is concerned, the focus should be on execution. And as far as the other areas of reforms are concerned, the action has to emanate from state governments.
Okay. Since you talked about privatization, Dr. Nageswaran, here's a question that's come in from Lloyd Matthias. And he says, while the government has done well managing the economy, privatization has been a huge disappointment. What explains this? And let me also ask you a follow-up question on that, because a budget commitment was made in terms of privatization of banks, yet we haven't seen the legislative framework move to pave the way for that. So how should we read that?
No, I think the reason why the budget took a realistically low number is sometimes giving a high target also means that there is undue pressure, which makes the government, having to disregard market conditions. So one has to have the freedom of operations with respect to the timing when these kinds of stocks are brought to the market. And that is the reason why, and also in keeping with its, recent philosophy of under-promising, the government decided to peg the privatization number at disinvestment receipts at a realistic number. But the commitment to privatization hasn't wavered, and that was evident in the manner despite all the obstacles and difficulties in the privatization of Air India. So the process obviously involves lots of hurdles and steps. We have multiple players can always bring in different kind of hurdles in the process, and all of them have to be tackled in such a way that whatever is done endures. So that takes time. But the underlying commitment to privatization is unwavering. That's the best I can say at this point.
The underlying commitment to privatization is unwavering, but can we expect a move towards bank privatization in the next session of Parliament?
I would pass on your question to the Secretary Deepam.
All right. I will leave it at that. There's another question that's come in, and this one is from Rajiv Varshney of Spectrum Insurance. He says the future income of insurance intermediaries in the form of renewal income should be considered by financial institutions for financing purposes to make them eligible for bank finance for their growth. It's quite a specific question. I don't know if you... okay. I will leave it that, leave this question as is, but address the larger issue of what's happening within the banking space as well as the NBFC space, because you spoke about IL&FS, and of course we've just now seen the Quota Committee present its report on what's happened as far as IL&FS is concerned and the lessons learnt thereof. We've also seen the big merger being announced between HDFC and HDFC Bank. Given the growth aspirations that India has, what more do you believe needs to be done in terms of reforming the financial sector, both NBFCs as well as the banking sector, to ensure that we can fuel this kind of growth that we aspire for?
No, I mean, straight off my head, I can say definitely we need ever since we announced license for private banks, we need more private banks to be licensed. Licensing on tap has to sort of really make licensing flow like tap. So clearly that needs to happen. And I think some of the larger, as the RBI's working group itself came out in a report a couple of years ago, some of the non-banking financial companies that are large enough should be encouraged to apply for banking licenses as well. And clearly, even spontaneously, whatever is happening on the technology-driven financial inclusion, the fintech revolution, will automatically enhance the spread of credit availability to larger segments of the population. So all we need to do is to stay on track with the developments that have happened in the last several years, which is to improve the bank's capital buffers and the natural recovery of the economy and the appetite of the corporate sector will create room for growth for both the banking and the non-banking financial corporations. All we need to do is to make sure that the boom that is likely to follow in the coming years stays more sustainable than the ones that we encountered 2 decades ago.
So we don't end up in a twin balance sheet problem again.
Yeah, I think that is the most important thing we need to watch out for, because the spontaneous process of recovery should get underway once the pandemic cloud lifts.
You brought up the issue of the extension of the Pradhan Mantri Anna Yojana for another 6 months. There's a question that's come in here from Pankaj Jain. He says, are increasing freebies acceptable in the road to $5 trillion economy? Will the government be able to continue with the freebies announced both at the central government level and the state government level? This is a complex issue, and it's not one that can be addressed in a 5-minute conversation here on stage. But this is something that you get, is bandied about on social media, this idea of what qualifies as a freebie to start with, whether it's populist or not populist. But how do you read what we're seeing happen, both at the central government level as well as the state government level?
See, I don't want to, as I say, you're right, I don't want to get into the larger philosophical discussion of freebies and entitlements, etc. But as the title of this session itself recognizes, there are compulsions that do have to be balanced in the situation that we find ourselves in. And therefore, providing targeted relief to vulnerable sections who are faced with a shock that is not of their own making, it's a moral obligation, and that is what the government is doing.
So it's not a political compulsion, it's an economic and a social compulsion.
Because, simultaneously, all of us are concerned about the bottom of the K as we talk about, and the government is recognizing that, and these steps are necessary in the current circumstances. I wouldn't put this under the larger debate of, entitlements and freebies, etc.
What would you put in the larger debate of freebies and entitlements?
That's a question for a different occasion.
Okay. But since we are talking about this issue, let me address the IMF paper that's just been put out by Dr. Surjit Bhalla and the former Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Virmani, where they talk about the success of the Pradhan Mantri Anna Yojana to say that it actually ensured that extreme poverty, which means less than $2 a day, we capped that to the same levels, pre-pandemic levels in 2020. Did this also in some way, the decision to extend it was taken before this paper came out, so I'm not trying to link the two, but I'm saying how much of what really weighed on the government's mind? Was it the fact that we've now seen inflation, we've seen a rise in prices? What was the compelling reason for the government to want to continue with this?
No, I think the main reason is that the geopolitical shock that has come and the impact it is having on food, fertilizer, and oil prices made the government realize that it should mitigate the suffering of vulnerable sections in some form or the other. So, therefore, this became a logical way because it is targeted, it is not an omnibus scheme, and that is the primary reason why this particular extension was made for 6 more months, because we haven't fully got the pandemic cloud lifted from our heads, and because the headlines are still dominated by the news of outbreaks elsewhere, and then on top of that you have another shock that has come. So that is the reason that prompted the government to extend the scheme. But I'm not surprised at the conclusion reached by Bhalla, Virmani and Basheen's paper, because in the United States as well, I have seen that once you take transfers and taxes into consideration, the inequality parameters show a very big improvement. Even in the United States, and Congressional Budget Office publishes those kinds of reports every year. So it is good that somebody attempted to do the same thing in the context of India as well. In fact, they have not addressed other forms of transfers that the government of India is making. If you take them into consideration as well, I'm sure the results will only get even further reinforced.
I'll get to other points of research in just a second, but since we are talking about rebuilding better and rebuilding for the future in a more equitable way, we've got a question that's come in from Sogo, I think. Our first 5-year plan in the 1950s targeted 100% literacy. After 75 years, we're barely 75%. Can we really plan for 100% literacy, or will it happen only after the 100-year celebration? Literacy, yeah.
No, I think I agree that the achievement with respect to literacy goals has fallen short of expectations, but I think there again, I would say the trend is in the right direction, but we should be more concerned about the functional aspects of the literacy, i.e. the ability of 9th graders and 8th graders to be able to read 8th grade, 9th grade text or do the math. That is more important. I think we need to focus more on the qualitative outcomes rather than the percentage of literacy that we are looking at.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Learning outcomes need to be improved, and that needs to be the focus area as well. One other issue that I want to get your comments on, and this is something that's close to my heart, is our continuing decline as far as the gender gap report is concerned of the World Economic Forum. India 140 at this point in time of women's participation in the workforce on the 4 key parameters that they map. What can be done to ensure that we do better on this front? The government has got schemes to try and enroll more girls into schools and higher education, both at the central government level as well as the state government level. But why do you believe that we are falling so behind, even within our peer group?
No, I think without understanding the underlying reasons as to why in these pandemic years women's labor force participation rate has declined drastically, it would be a bit premature to propose solutions to that. I think we first need to understand what are the specific factors that drove this, how much of it is temporary, how much of it is reversible, and sometimes to the extent possible, governments can only put in enabling conditions for women's labor force participation rate to improve. But to the extent that some of this choice is voluntary, governments cannot influence the change. But wherever the choice has been induced by economic or other circumstances not of their choice, then it is the government's moral responsibility to reverse those conditions. I think that is what is happening. And to a large extent, I feel once the pandemic really sort of fades away from our memory and its influencing role in our day-to-day lives, some amount of improvement in labor force participation rate should begin to happen. And who knows, it could also be a problem of measurement. So I think without understanding the phenomena fully, it will be a bit premature to offer, sort of short-term answers here.
Well, another area where measurement is often questioned is the employment data or the unemployment data. Yeah. Now, whatever data points that you're looking at, where do things currently stand?
There is obviously, there is a recovery in terms of the flow, in terms of the change at the margin, it is improving. But are we there at a level where we can be happy with the labor force participation rate? We are not. And separately, I do agree with you that that is one area we need to work on. That is getting timely and reliable labor force and employment data in the country. Only then we can talk about proposed actions.
Well, that's something that we've been waiting for as well for a while. But linked to that, I want to understand from you, how confident do you feel about rural recovery at this point in time? Just with one context, you talked about, the possibility of wheat exports opening up in a bigger way on account of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Many expect that to be an advantage as far as India is concerned. That's just one aspect. But overall, how do you read what's happening in rural India today, both in terms of consumption, recovery, incomes?
No, I think I was talking to Mr. C.K. Ranganathan for a few minutes before we walked in here, and compared to a month or so ago, he himself sees the beginning of what we used to call green shoots in rural demand, and I hope it sustains and it blooms. It is given that we had a normal monsoon and good agricultural production, it is that is not the primary cause, therefore, of declining rural demand. It is quite possibly the case that some of the migrant labor that returned to their villages hasn't found its way back into urban centers. And to that extent, that remittances from urban to rural India may be one of the reasons. So we need to study these, understand what kind of change has happened in these income remittances, and that could be the reason. And if that is the case, and that's a big if that is the case, then once again, as economic recovery, activity, construction, infrastructure, build out, all these things recover, I have a feeling that some of these migrant labor will find its way back to urban employment, which in turn should sort of create its own indirect positive effects on rural purchasing power and rural demand.
Mm-hmm. How big a risk is the commodity price inflation as far as sectors like construction, real estate, etc. are concerned? Because steel prices, cement prices, paint prices, just about everything surging at this point in time. Forget oil. How much of an impact is that likely to have? Could it derail the recovery that we are seeing in some of these sectors, for instance?
The impact is what you have seen in RBI revising its growth forecast. That is the impact.
But if this were to sustain, do you think that this could be one of the biggest challenges that we are going to have to deal with? And is there any way for the government to be able to offset this?
No, there are, to the extent possible, obviously, as I said earlier also, there are trade-offs. You need to keep one eye on the fiscal balance, because if you end up, let's say, mitigating every problem through a fiscal solution, then naturally your deficit will blow out of proportion, which will have an impact on bond yields, which will further compound the problem you are trying to solve. So it is a trade-off situation, and it is very difficult to be precise with one's responses at this point in time. As the economic survey pointed out, in these extremely uncertain times, you just have to cross the river by feeling one stone at a time.
Yes, and you have to be dynamic in your assessment as well as in your response. So let me end then by asking you talked about the green shoots that are very visible across different sectors at this point in time. What is the red flag that you're most concerned about?
No, the red flag, as we have been talking in the last 20 minutes or so, is really the persistence of the hydrocarbon fuel price and the potential impact of the Federal Reserve aggressively tightening monetary policy to the extent that the market is pricing in today. That will have impact on global capital flows. And as a country with the current account deficit, then we will naturally also be impacted. So to me, the two risks that I flagged, the oil price as well as the Federal Reserve monetary policy, are the two red flags to watch out for.
The two red flags to watch out for. You've now what? It's been a quarter that you've been in government, Dr. Nageswaran?
Not yet.
Just about.
Yeah.
So what's the experience been like now as an economist within government? Do you understand the compulsions of the government better?
Oh, absolutely. No, you put it very well. I think public policy making, as they always said in academic literature, is a wicked problem. It's not an easy problem to solve because so many angles have to be considered, and you have to navigate the trade-offs, which we all understand do exist in our own personal lives, but we don't recognize that. You don't have optimal corner solutions. You have to do constrained optimization all the time, and you are not going to be able to please everybody. So you have to make the best possible trade-off, and judgments can be different. So those who are looking at it from the outside are justified based on information that they have in interpreting it in a particular way. But inside the government, you have to make your best call, and you are making it in real time, whereas outsiders have the luxury of judging you in hindsight.
Well, we hope that the calls that are made inside of government and outside of government do take India forward and propel us to the kind of growth that we aspire for. Dr. Nageswaran, a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us here on this session at the AIMA National Conference. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, the Chief Economic Advisor.